Have you ever experienced a moment, and I mean this whether you're reading a book or watching a film or even just going through a period of intense, prolonged stress in your own life where this absolute suffocating dread is just instantly shattered by an overwhelming explosion of hope?
Oh, that is such a specific feeling.
Right. Think about that feeling for a second. As a listener, you are pressed to the absolute limit. You're completely out of options. The proverbial walls are closing in. And just when your brain registers that, you literally cannot take another single second of the pressure.
The dawn breaks?
Yes, the cavalry arrives. The tension snaps. And suddenly you can breathe again. If you're someone who loves to learn, to really dissect why certain moments resonate so deeply in our bones and how we can apply those narrative mechanics to our own understanding of resilience, then you are in exactly the right place today.
It is a very, it's a visceral physical reaction when that shift occurs. Your shoulders literally drop, your heart rate alters. That transition from despair to hope isn't just some clever narrative trick. It represents a fundamental emotional release that storytellers have been attempting to perfect for centuries.
Totally.
And it's something that, when executed correctly, it perfectly mirrors the most profound defining turning points in human psychology.
And that is the entire mission of our deep dive today. We're going to explore the architecture of a perfect literary turning point. How does a writer construct that exact moment of release so that it feels, earned rather than cheap?
Which is incredibly hard to do.
It is. To do this, we are looking at a passionate, incredibly analytical breakdown of what is widely considered one of the most legendary chapters in all of fantasy literature. We are jumping into The Return of the King, specifically Book 5, Chapter 5, famously titled The Ride of the Rohirrim.
It is genuinely a masterclass in pacing, structural tension, and emotional payoff.
It really is. And our guide for this journey is this fantastic piece of source material coming to us from the Princess Toynard YouTube channel.
A great channel.
Yeah, if you aren't familiar with their work, it's a wonderful hub for magical fandom discussions and incredibly thoughtful Tolkien deep dives. The creator looks past just the plot, the basic who swung a sword at whom, and really digs into the underlying themes, the character arcs, and the raw emotional power behind epic moments like this.
To really peel back the layers.
Exactly. So we are going to take their insights, break them down, and figure out why this specific chapter works so flawlessly. Okay, let's unpack this, because to really understand the dawn, we have to spend some time talking about the dark. We need to set the stage.
Right, because you cannot have that visceral explosion of hope without laying a massive, immovable foundation of absolute despair. The analysis we're reviewing points out that this chapter is the direct follow-up to a preceding chapter called The Siege of Gondor.
Which is heavy.
Incredibly heavy. And the source material explicitly uses the phrase suffocating dread to describe the atmosphere leading up to this point. We really have to ground ourselves in the sheer scale of that situation to understand the turning point. We are in the city of Minas Tirith. It is on the absolute brink of total collapse.
Yeah.
The forces of Sauron are pressing mercilessly against its walls. The defenders of Gondor are described not just as tired, but as fundamentally battered. They are exhausted to their very marrow, and most importantly, they are entirely out of time.
Time really is the ultimate antagonist here. It's not just the physical enemy or the siege towers, it's the ticking clock. Let's quantify that suffocating dread for a second. We aren't talking about a mild disadvantage. You can almost feel the oxygen leaving the room as you read the preceding text.
You really can.
The defenders are trapped inside a fortress that is failing. The city gates are physically breaking. The sky above them is literally darkened. And the review highlights that the chapter we are focusing on today, The Ride of the Rohirrim, explodes with motion and sound exactly at the moment when Gondor has 0 seconds left on the clock.
0 seconds.
And then from the north comes the sound of horns.
The shattering of the tension, it's brilliant. The source emphasizes that the author builds this moment with masterful tension and then breaks it completely, but they don't just appear. The review specifically notes that the Rohirrim, the horse lords of Rohan, arrive like a force of nature.
Let's pause on that phrase. Arrives like a force of nature. That's a very specific, deliberate choice of words from the reviewer. Why frame it that way?
Yeah.
When you describe a cavalry charge, not just as a military maneuver, flanking the enemy, basic battlefield tactics, but as a natural phenomenon, it elevates the entire event. It stops being just an army arriving and becomes something elemental. It's an earthquake. It's a tidal wave.
Yeah, I can't argue with a hurricane.
Exactly. It is simply inevitable.
That concept of inevitability is key to the psychological impact. By describing them as a force of nature, the narrative strips away the politics, the desperate strategy, and the mechanics of the war in that single moment, leaving only this raw, unstoppable momentum.
Wow. Yeah.
But we need to analyze the contrast here. Why does the author force the reader to sit in that suffocating dread for an entire chapter beforehand? It is because the eruption of hope is mathematically dependent on the depth of the preceding despair.
Okay, but let me play devil's advocate here for a second.
Mhm.
If we look at this strictly from a modern narrative standpoint, the cavalry arriving exactly at the second the clock hits zero, doesn't that feel a bit cheap?
How so?
Well, it borders on a deus ex machina, right?
Yeah.
How does the source or the text itself defend this from just being convenient plot armor to save the protagonists?
That is exactly why the mathematical dependence is so crucial to understand. A deus ex machina feels unearned because it's a solution dropped from the sky without setup, bypassing the struggle. But the reviewer argues that the structural technique here is entirely different.
Right.
We only truly appreciate the magnitude of a solution when we have been forced to fully understand and sit with the sheer, crushing severity of the problem. If the cavalry arrived 5 minutes into the siege, it would just be a convenient military reinforcement.
It wouldn't hit the same.
Not at all. Because they arrive when the gates are broken and all hope is entirely lost, their arrival becomes mythic. The dread isn't just a backdrop. It acts as a necessary emotional multiplier for the hope.
So the higher the drop on the roller coaster, the more intense the momentum at the bottom.
Oh.
The reader has paid for that rescue by enduring the psychological weight of the siege alongside the characters.
Exactly. They earned it.
That is a crucial takeaway for anyone trying to communicate an idea or tell a compelling story, whether in a novel or a boardroom. You can't rush to the rescue. You have to let your audience feel the true weight of the problem before you introduce the solution.
Precisely. But what makes this specific turning point so iconic isn't just the logistical fact that the Rohirrim arrive. The analysis makes it very clear that it is how the text describes their arrival that cements it in our cultural memory. It's not a dry recounting of troop movement.
Oh, not at all.
It is a full-blown, immersive, sensory experience.
It is entirely immersive. The review focuses heavily on the visual and the auditory spectacle of this moment. We are given these incredibly sharp, vivid details that cut right through the darkness of the previous chapter.
The contrast is striking.
The source mentions the rising sun glinting off the spearheads, the wind suddenly catching the banners, and, crucially, the hooves drumming across the Pelennor Fields. It engages the eye and the ear simultaneously. You aren't just reading it, you are watching and listening to it happen in your mind.
What's fascinating here is how the mechanics of the writing itself mirror the action taking place in the narrative. The reviewer uses the term musical prose, which is an essential concept to unpack.
Musical prose.
Yeah. Rhythm in writing isn't just about making sentences sound poetic. It can actually be engineered to mimic physical action. In this case, the prose simulates a cavalry charge. The drumming of the hooves becomes the actual pacing of the sentences. The syllable counts, the placement of the punctuation, it all accelerates as the charge accelerates.
I want to make that abstract concept of musical prose really concrete for you listening. Think about it like this. If you are reading a scene about a character having a panic attack, a masterful writer will use a breathless, frantic, run-on sentence that just keeps going and going without any commas or periods, so you literally feel like you were running out of breath just trying to read it in your own head.
Right, the structure mimics the emotion.
Yes. But here, in this chapter, it's the opposite. The author builds a steady, pounding, rhythmic sequence. Boom, boom. It mimics an unstoppable march. Your brain is actively processing the rhythm of a cavalry charge while you read the words.
The physiological response to that kind of writing is very real. Studies on how humans process rhythmic text show that our internal pacing, even our breathing, can synchronize with the meter of the words.
That is wild.
When the prose is rhythmic and sweeping, it forces the reader into the physical momentum of the scene. The writing itself becomes a physical force.
But the review makes a brilliant pivot here. While that grand, sweeping, cinematic rhythm is playing out on this massive, epic scale, the scene is anchored by something deeply intimate.
The human element.
Exactly. It's not just faceless horses and abstract spears. At the very center of this massive rhythmic storm is a deeply personal human element, King Théoden.
And this is where the thematic resonance of the text really solidifies. Théoden stands right at the heart of the charge. The analysis notes that this chapter effectively completes his character arc. an arc that began developing chapters ago in a section called The Muster of Rohan.
Here's where it gets really interesting. When we first met Théoden early in the story, he was the exact opposite of a warrior king. He was a frail, manipulated ruler. He had been essentially poisoned by bad counsel, paralyzed by indecision, weak, and utterly defeatist.
Almost a ghost of a king.
Right. But here, at the climax of the charge, the review states he is someone entirely reborn in courage and clarity.
That word reborn is incredibly potent. He has completely shed the version of himself that was manipulated and constrained by fear. And as he rallies his riders, he delivers what the source describes as one of the most electrifying speeches in fantasy literature.
Oh, it gives me chills just thinking about it.
But it is absolutely vital to analyze the specific tone of that speech. It is not a generic Hollywood, we will win this day and go home to our family's battle cry.
It's not at all. The review describes the speech as fierce, defiant, and filled with fury and acceptance of mortality. I want to dig into that. He isn't promising his men survival. He's basically promising them a meaningful, glorious end. But let me challenge that from a leadership perspective.
Sure.
If a leader stands up before a massive battle and essentially says, hey, everyone, we are all going to die today, isn't that inherently defeatist? How does that inspire anyone?
It seems counterintuitive, I agree.
Right.
But let's thoroughly unpack this acceptance of mortality.
Mm-hmm.
Why is a leader who has accepted his own death so uniquely terrifying to an enemy, and yet so deeply inspiring to his followers?
Yeah, why?
It boils down to leverage. Fear of death or fear of loss is the ultimate leverage. It is how armies are controlled, how panic is spread, and how morale is systematically broken. The enemy relies on your desire to survive to make you hesitate.
Well, wow.
But once a leader, and by extension his entire force, accepts that they are already dead, that leverage completely evaporates. There's nothing left for the enemy to threaten them with.
It's the ultimate psychological freedom. Think about what it means to be reborn in courage and clarity in that context. When Théoden was being manipulated earlier in the story, his fear of failure and destruction was being weaponized against him.
Absolutely.
He was paralyzed by the endless permutations of what might go wrong. But by accepting the absolute worst-case scenario that they will ride out and die on this field, all that mental fog just vanishes. It allows for pure, unadulterated, decisive action. And honestly, we see this psychological mechanism play out in real life all the time.
Exactly. The psychology of anticipatory dread is well documented. When people are faced with a massive crisis, the anxiety of what if is almost always more paralyzing than the crisis itself.
Always.
The cognitive load of trying to prevent the worst-case scenario consumes all your energy.
Right. Imagine you're agonizing over losing a job or a business failing or a major relationship ending. You spend months twisting yourself into knots trying to save it, and the stress eats you alive. You are constantly on the defensive.
Just burning energy.
Yes. But the moment you finally accept, okay, the worst is happening, the business is closing, the relationship is over, a very strange, paradoxical clarity washes over you. The exhausting anxiety of anticipation is gone, replaced by the clarity of dealing with the present reality.
It's liberating.
You stop worrying about saving the old structure and start focusing on doing what needs to be done right now. Théoden's acceptance of mortality strips away all his previous frailty because he's no longer trying to protect himself.
And that profound psychological shift is highly contagious. That acceptance of mortality isn't limited to the king alone. It ripples outward, applying to the entire army of the Rohirrim. The source text makes this incredibly poignant observation. The Rohirrim charge knowing many of them will die.
And they ride anyway.
That is such a heavy, powerful concept. Sauron's army, which has been presented as this unstoppable, mechanized juggernaut up to this point, is completely caught off balance. They falter under this sudden, devastating, fearless assault.
They don't know how to compute it. Exactly. But here is a fascinating detail the review focuses on. And it's a crucial distinction that completely subverts typical fantasy tropes. The text explicitly states that the Rohirrim don't actually win the war in this moment. They just change its direction.
And the review is very careful to call that distinction crucial. If we connect this to the bigger picture, we are looking at the strategic and psychological concept of buying time. The purpose of this mythic, sensory, musical charge is not to neatly tie up the narrative with a bow, defeat the antagonist, and roll the credits.
Right.
The purpose is to give Gondor space to breathe, to rally, to remember that they are not alone.
But wait, let me push back on that idea. If you launch a massive suicidal cavalry charge and you don't achieve total victory right then and there isn't that technically a failure, isn't shifting momentum without winning just prolonging the inevitable?
In a simplistic view of conflict, perhaps, but reality and highly realistic literature operates differently. In massive conflicts, whether it's a global war, a complex political movement, or even trying to dismantle a deeply ingrained systemic issue in society, single moments almost never result in total, immediate victory.
That's true.
You don't just charge down a hill and suddenly the world is perfect. Instead, these massive, concentrated efforts are designed to break the enemy's rhythm. Sauron's forces had the rhythm of inevitable, unopposed victory. The Rohirrim disrupt that algorithm. They don't finish the fight, but they create the necessary conditions for the fight to be won eventually.
I see. It's about changing the board state.
Right.
I think about how this applies to so many areas of a career or personal development. You might put a monumental, exhausting amount of effort into a project, or trying to turn around a failing department at work. And after all that massive effort, the problem isn't entirely solved.
Right, you haven't won yet.
The department still has issues. And it is so easy to feel crushed and discouraged by that, to feel like the effort was wasted. But what this literary analysis teaches us is the immense value of shifting momentum. Sometimes a massive effort just buys you the breathing room you need to figure out the next step. You change the direction of the battle, even if the battle is still raging.
That breathing room is psychological as much as it is tactical. The source explicitly mentions that the charge gives Gondor space to remember they are not alone.
Oh, I love that.
That specific realization that their isolation is an illusion is one of the most powerful restorative forces for a battered human spirit. When you are under siege, your perspective narrows until you believe you are the only person left in the world suffering this way. Breaking that illusion ties directly into what the review identifies as the deepest, most resonant theme of this entire sequence, unity.
Yes, unity. Because the Rohirrim aren't just random mercenaries who happen to be riding by and decided to help. They are fulfilling an ancient oath between the Kingdom of Rohan and the Kingdom of Gondor.
An ancient pact.
Right. The source uses this incredible phrase, stating that in this chapter, loyalty becomes a weapon as powerful as any sword. They are two entirely separate peoples, with completely separate histories, cultures, and internal problems, choosing to stand together in the darkest possible hour.
Let's really zero in on that phrase, loyalty becomes a weapon. How does an intangible, abstract, moral concept like loyalty or an oath have actual physical weight on a battlefield?
It's a great question.
It's because warfare, and really any great sustained human endeavor, is ultimately driven by morale. Sauron's forces operate purely on fear, domination, and numerical superiority. They function like a machine. But an ancient oath introduces a variable that a machine cannot calculate self-sacrifice for the sake of another based on a shared history.
The machine doesn't understand that.
Exactly. The knowledge that an ally is fighting not just for their own immediate survival but to honor a promise made by their ancestors hardens an army's resolve in a way that physical armor simply cannot.
It transforms the entire context of the conflict. The review points out that in this exact moment, the War of the Ring shifts from being a scattered resistance into a true coalition of hope. It's no longer just isolated pockets of people trying to hide behind walls and not die. It's a unified, proactive front.
That changes everything.
Think about the profound psychological comfort of that. Imagine you are in your absolute darkest hour, your defenses are shattered, and suddenly someone shows up purely because of a promise made generations ago. The power of kept promises over vast spans of time is staggering to think about. It tells the defenders that the world still has order, that honor still exists, and that they matter enough to be saved.
It connects their present, isolated suffering to a deep historical continuity. Gondor isn't just fighting for their survival today. They suddenly realize they are the beneficiaries of a relationship built by their ancestors. It proves that the history they share is alive, active, and capable of intervening in the present.
But, and this is a massive but, that the source material absolutely does not shy away from. While this coalition of hope is beautiful and awe-inspiring, the text violently reminds us that it is not without a heavy, heartbreaking cost. The review is very clear that woven directly into this triumph is something profoundly tragic.
Yes. The text observes that the beauty of the charge lies partly in its fleeting nature. Glory and loss walk side by side across the battlefield. The reviewer points out that Tolkien, as a writer who experienced the horrors of real warfare firsthand, never lets his readers forget the cost of this action. He does not allow the victory to be bloodless.
This raises an important question, though, and I want to play devil's advocate again. Why? Why is it so important that the author doesn't sanitize the victory? We read epic fantasy to escape the drudgery and sadness of the real world, right?
That's the common assumption.
Right. We want the heroes to ride in, save the day, defeat the bad guys, high five, and go home into a feast. Why intentionally inject this profound tragedy into what should be the ultimate moment of triumph? Doesn't that just ruin the high for the reader?
This raises an important question. Because sanitizing the victory would completely rob it of its humanity and its underlying truth, rendering it emotionally hollow. The human brain is incredibly adept at recognizing when a narrative is lying to it.
We know when it's fake.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If everyone survived and the charge was effortless, it wouldn't be heroic. It would just be an amusement park ride. There would be no stakes. The cost is exactly what gives the glory its immense weight. If we go back to the idea that courage is action despite fear, that fear has to be justified by actual consequences, the threat must be real.
That makes perfect sense.
By showing us the loss walking side by side with the glory, the author deeply respects the intelligence and the emotional maturity of the reader. The narrative is saying, yes, hope is real and hope is powerful, but hope requires sacrifice.
The cost is what grounds the mythic eruption of hope. It keeps the story from floating away into fairy tale nonsense. When you read the reviewer's phrase that glory and loss walk side by side, it hits you so hard because it perfectly mirrors the inescapable duality of real life.
It's very grounded.
Every massive achievement, every great leap forward, whether it's building a company, raising a family, or achieving a lifelong dream, usually requires leaving something behind, enduring painful setbacks, or sacrificing something precious. And I want to delve deeper into another phrase from the review, the fleeting nature of the beauty here.
It's a beautifully melancholic observation from the Princess Toy Nerd review. It touches on the philosophical idea that the most beautiful moments in literature, and indeed in human experience, are often those that cannot possibly last. The charge of the Rohirrim is a crescendo. And by definition, you cannot sustain a crescendo indefinitely.
Exactly. The sun glinting on the spears, the wind catching the banners, the perfect rhythm of the hooves. It is a perfect suspended moment in time. But you know as you read it that in 5 minutes, that beautiful formation is going to dissolve into chaotic, muddy, bloody, exhausting hand-to-hand combat.
The reality of war.
The absolute perfection of the charge is inherently fleeting. And knowing it's going to end creates this incredibly bittersweet emotional resonance for you as a reader. You want to freeze time and just live in the thunder of that initial glorious charge forever, but you can't. The narrative, just like life, has to move forward into the messy reality of what comes next.
And moving forward requires us to look at what all of this ultimately means for the thematic core of the story. The Source Review argues that this entire chapter exists to reinforce one of the most central ideas in the author's work. It provides a definitive answer to the question of what courage actually is.
And how do they define it?
It defines courage not as the absence of fear, but as taking action despite it. The Rohirrim are vastly outnumbered. The enemy is described as vast and seemingly infinite. The logical, mathematical outcome of their charge is their own destruction. But they look at those odds, and they refuse to yield to despair.
So, what does this all mean? If we boil it all down for you listening right now, unpacking this specific definition of courage is the ultimate actionable takeaway of this deep dive. True courage isn't being a fearless, unfeeling superhero who never experiences doubt or terror.
No, that's just a cartoon.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's not relatable, and honestly, it's not even real courage. If you aren't afraid, you aren't risking anything. You're just doing something easy. True courage, as perfectly illustrated by this text, is looking at a vast, overwhelming enemy, looking at a situation where you are guaranteed to suffer, feeling the absolute, paralyzing terror of that reality, and then saying, we ride anyway.
It's the conscious refusal to yield.
Yes. And as the review powerfully states, that specific refusal is what changes the direction of the world.
It changes the narrative entirely. And before we conclude, we should also look at the structural genius mentioned by the reviewer. We've talked a lot about the themes, but the architecture of the book itself is vital. This isn't just a great scene existing in a vacuum.
Right, context is everything.
By placing this cinematic and mythic chapter exactly here, right after the suffocating dread of the siege chapter, the author is performing a structural masterstroke. He injects massive momentum back into the narrative at the exact second it was flatlining into absolute despair. He reminds the reader, and this is a lesson that transcends the fantasy genre, that help may be riding over the horizon, precisely when you, like the defenders of Gondor, feel the most hopeless and isolated.
The structural placement literally manipulates our own emotional state as readers. We are exhausted from reading about the siege. The pacing of the previous chapter has dragged us down into the mud. We are practically ready to give up on the city ourselves.
You feel the fatigue.
We really do. And then, boom, horns in the north. The structure mirrors the emotional journey. And honestly, bringing this full circle, this kind of structural and emotional brilliance, is exactly why we even have sources like the Princess Toyner YouTube channel to draw from today. It's why communities of readers and fans gather to dissect these elements year after year.
Absolutely. The review ends with a call to action for that channel, positioning it as a place dedicated to breaking down themes, character arcs, and the emotional power hidden within epic literary moments. They describe their community as a place for magical fandom discussions to keep the adventure going.
Which is such a great mission.
It really is. And we really have to ask why channels like this and deep dives like the one we are doing right now matter so much to people. Why do we spend hours analyzing a fictional cavalry charge?
It's because human beings have this innate, hardwired need to break down mythic moments. We don't just want to be passively entertained by a cool action sequence. We want to be deeply moved. And once we are moved, we have this intense desire to understand why we were moved.
It's a search for meaning.
Exactly. We want to share the emotional resonance of a character arc like King Théoden's with other people because discussing it makes us feel connected. It validates our own emotional responses and helps us articulate our own inner lives.
And, perhaps more importantly, it provides a philosophical roadmap for our own lives. When we dissect how courage, loyalty, and acceptance of mortality work in a fantasy novel, we are secretly practicing how to apply those exact concepts in reality. We study these epic stories because they contain profound, universal human truths wrapped in the highly accessible metaphor of a cavalry charge.
Exactly. And I just want to enthusiastically validate you, the learner, listening to this right now, for having that exact kind of curiosity. It takes a certain kind of wonderful, inquisitive mind to look beneath the surface of what is essentially an action scene, a really cool cinematic moment with horses and spears, and say, wait a minute, what is this actually teaching me about the psychology of accepting the worst-case scenario? What is this teaching me about the difference between shifting momentum and achieving total victory?
It's an active process.
You're seeking out those profound human truths hidden inside the spectacle. And that is an absolutely brilliant way to consume media and navigate the world.
It elevates the act of reading or watching from passive consumption to active engagement. It transforms a simple story into an applied philosophy.
It really, truly does. And as we wrap up this exploration of the perfect literary turning point, I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over. Something for you to explore on your own that builds purely on the themes we've pulled from this amazing source material.
It's a powerful one.
The review brilliantly points out that loyalty and ancient oaths can function as weapons just as powerful, if not more so, than actual physical swords. It makes you wonder, if you look at your own life, what are the ancient oaths or the core unspoken commitments you've made to yourself or to the people you love? What are those deep-seated promises you hold on to when things get difficult? And if things ever reached a point of suffocating dread in your own world, which of those core commitments would serve as your own sudden eruption of hope, giving you the strength to change the entire direction of your personal battles? Take some time to think about what your horns in the north sound like.
A profound question to carry forward, and a vital reminder of the power of our own internal commitments.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the text. We hope you enjoyed exploring the complex mechanics of hope, dread, and narrative structure as much as we did. Keep asking the hard questions, keep looking beneath the surface of the media you consume, and keep seeking out those aha moments in absolutely everything you read.